Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Torah portion is Vayikel Pekudei. The craftsmen and craftswomen building the tabernacle are commanded to weave curtains showcasing images of two cherubs and fashion golden statues to match. We wonder how these winged creatures differ from the golden calf and the forbidden images that the Bible ridicules with such scorn. So take out your chisels and your mallets and join us for Man-Made. Well, welcome, Rabbi. Another week of Madlik Disruptive Torah.
And we get a double parsha this week, so how could it be bad?
A double parsha gives us more things to pick from. So yes, that is great. And we are building the tabernacle. We've talked about it, but as I said, we're talking about man-made. Many of the psukim that we're going to deal with are literal cut and pastes from previous parshiot, where we were commanded to make these things, make the menorah, make the cherubs. But here, we're actually putting the rubber to the metal. And I think this is the appropriate time to discuss making the idol and how can you do it. So, to give you a sense of how much our Parsha really, I would say, celebrates artistry and artifact and the ability of man to make things. I'm just going to quote a few verses, but when you read it this Shabbat, you will see that there is a reason that the school in Israel that teaches art is called Betzalel, because this Parsha just celebrates artifice. In Exodus 35:21, it says, "And everyone who excelled in ability and everyone whose spirit was moved came bringing to God an offering for the work of the tent of meeting. And all the skilled women spun with their own hands and brought what they had spun in blue, purple, crimson yards, and fine linen, endowing him with a divine spirit of skill, ability, and knowledge, Ruach Elokim b'chachma, b'tvuna, u'b'dat, in every kind of craft, and inspiring him to make designs for work in gold, silver, and copper, to cut stones for setting, and to carve wood, to work in every kind of designer's craft." So that sets the stage. This Parsha is a celebration of artifice. And I can say it right from the beginning. It's not a secret. Jews and making statues and making images, there is a tight dance going on. But I had to give that context because if there is a case to be made for human beings, for Jews expressing their image and their spirit of God inside of them by creating, this is the Parsha. So now let's get to the meat of things and to the subject that we are going to discuss. In Exodus 36:8, it says, "Then all the skilled among those engaged in the work made the tabernacle of 10 strips of cloth, which they made of fine twisted linen, blue, purple, crimson yarns. Into these they worked as a design of cherubim. These are two cherubs. So already, before we even get to the iconic gold cherubs that are on top of the ark, even when they are making the tapestries, they are making images in the tapestry of these cherubs. Exodus 36:35, they made the curtain of blue, purple, and crimson yarns and fine twisted linen, working into it a design of the cherubim, these two cherubs. And then in Exodus 37:7, we get to those iconic golden statues. He made 2 cherubim of gold. He made them of hammered work at the 2 ends of the cover, one cherub at one end and the other cherub at the other end. He made the cherubim of one piece with the cover as its 2 ends. The cherubim had their wings spread out above, shielding the cover with their wings. They faced each other. The faces of the cherubim were turned toward the cover. Rabbi, maybe you can forget about the tapestry, but have you ever seen this kind of language of building an image besides the golden calf in the Bible?
Well, and it's so central to the tabernacle, right? It kind of seems like everything is built up to the ark, and the ark is built up for the cherubim. So here we have an idol on top of the ark that held the tablets. We have an idol. Isn't that crazy? And the funny thing is that the broken tablets were also in the ark. And the tablets were broken because they built an idol. And here there's an idol on top of the ark.
So I love the fact that you bring up that the broken tablets are inside of the ark. And I was going to mention this later. But when the first tablets were made by God, but the second tablets were made by man. In Exodus 34:1, it says, God said to Moses, carve 2 tablets of stone like the first, and I will inscribe upon the tablets the words that were on the first tablets which you shattered. The word that it used for carve those 2 tablets is pisal lecha. Pesel is literally, I knew Carl Katz, who used to be the head of Bezalel. Then he came to the Israel Museum. And when he wanted to make a sculpture garden, the Rabbanut was all over him. Sculptures in Hebrew are psalim. They said, how can you make a garden of psalim in Jerusalem? So we already have this tension between good pestles and bad pestles, so to speak. It is kind of fascinating, but you're right. This is the crux. This is ground zero.
Yeah, that's so interesting. You mentioned Carl Katz. Carl Katz and my father grew up together. They went to school together. It's a small world. Everything comes back to Carl Katz. But that's right. A sculpture garden is, that's psalim. We're all over it. Everywhere you see idols. But then at the same time, idols are what is prohibited. And the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, the entire book tells you about how evil psalim are. So something crazy is going on.
Absolutely. There's a mystery here. I don't know if we're going to crack it, but we have identified it for sure. So as I said before, we're in Exodus 37. And in Exodus 25, literally, you can track, it was almost as though paragraph by paragraph, word by words, 25:18 says, make 2 cherubim of gold, make them of hammered work. It's literally the same. I think it's very appropriate that we're talking about this tonight, even though this is not the first time it's mentioned, because we're going to focus on the craft. We're going to focus on the prohibition, but also maybe the requirement that man make them in a certain way. They are man-made, and we know that this week because we have these craftsmen. But most of the commentaries that explain these verses, you've got to go back into Exodus 25 when it's first mentioned. So Rashi on cherubim says they had the form of a child's face. Angelic, right? Isn't that the image that we have so much of cherubim, these little gold children with wings on their back and smiling blissfully at each other?
Love it. Yeah, that is the image we have. The sources that we're going to study tonight are not so sure about that, but that's the image that we grew up with, basically.
We did, and before we even get to all of those midrashim...
And by the way, the reason we grew up with it is because that's what Rashi says. And, Rashi becomes like, as if it's written in the Torah itself.
True. But there's a higher authority to Rashi, and that is the Bible itself. And the first time we've been exposed to cherubim, I don't think they had baby faces. If you remember Genesis 3:24, after the original sin, it was driven out, and east of the Garden of Eden were stationed the cherubim, and their fiery, ever-turning sword to guard the way to the tree of life. So our first experience with the cherubim was certainly not, we didn't picture these two little fluttering babies with wings on them. So it's not altogether clear, is it?
Well, it's not clear from the beginning of Genesis what they were. All we know is that they were frightened, right? They were protection. So they scared people away somehow.
And they had a sword, and they were...
Right, I'm saying they scared people. They had a different purpose. I mean, it doesn't explicitly say they weren't children. It just doesn't seem to fit into the mood exactly.
Yeah. One thing that I think we are seeing is, a cherub is a single cherub, and two cherubs are cherubim. I was almost thinking of calling the podcast Cherubi Cherubim. But they do come in pairs. That is kind of interesting. But the Talmud and the rabbinic literature has so many different concepts. And your wife Sharon should be really here, because in the illustrated Haggadot that we're going to use in a few weeks, they're full of birds. There are those that believe they were a certain type of bird. In Ezekiel and in some of the prophets, we have these Maaseh Merkava, the chariots, and there you have winged creatures that are four-footed. The gamut of what these cherubs could be really goes from babies to birds to large animals. And in the notes, I do quote a wonderful survey in thetorah.com. What kind of creatures are the cherubim? It's by Dr. Ranan Echler, and if you're interested, definitely take a look at the source sheet. But he concludes that ultimately he really feels that the cherub was a combination of two things, and that's what unites them all. So no matter whether it was a bird or whether with a human face, or it was an ox with wings, or whatever it was, he feels that it was this kind of combination that was what it's about. But the bottom line is that's not the subject of tonight's discussion. Whatever they are real images. This is a three-dimensional figure, and that's what we're going to be focused on. But it is kind of fascinating what they were and how that impacted maybe what was permitted to be shown in illustrated manuscripts and mosaic floors. Who knows? We certainly like to think that we don't permit any images, but there certainly are a lot of images in our story. So that kind of becomes fascinating. I'm sure you've seen some amazing illustrated manuscripts in your day, Rabbi.
I have, and this is great. So let's continue the discussion, because I think there's a lot here.
So in one of the sources, I quote, you can all of a sudden see that the rabbis themselves were sensitive to the question that we're raising tonight. So in the Chizkuni, after he says that they were a certain type of bird, and then he goes on to say, and even the Torah in the second of the Ten Commandments has expressly forbidden us to make anything that is like creatures on earth or in the sky. The reason why the making of the cherubs is exempt from this was it was not made to be worshipped, but to remain hidden inside the most inaccessible part of the Torah. So this touches upon a discussion we had a few weeks ago, which is so much of the Mishkan and the later temple was putting an enigma into an enigma, was making surrounding barriers so that almost praying outside on the wall became almost a natural thing to do. But it is fascinating that one of the reasons that the rabbis felt this was different than your typical graven image was that it was kind of hidden. That's kind of fascinating.
That is kind of fascinating. Yes, it is. That's really good. Okay, good. And I was just looking at the article in the Torah, and the article that you quote here. And that's also interesting. The idea of them being a composite, which is really the point you made. They're always cheruvim. They're always in the plural, cherubim. And the question is why that is exactly. I mean, you're interested in the fact that the plural of cherub is cherubim rather than cherubs. It should really be cherubs. I never thought, in all my life, I never thought of that before. But you are 100% right. Where does the word cherubim come from?
And is that an English word? I mean, is that how...
I mean, it looks... I'm just looking in Svaria. It looks like that's the way they translate it. So I guess that's... They made it into an English word.
So this might be the only English word based on a Hebrew word that is grammatically correct. I mean, it has the grammar built into it. It's fine.
Very good. This discussion is worth it just for that.
So the Chizkuni continues, and he's troubled. He is troubled by the fact that this is going against, I would say, a beferish pasuk. It says in Exodus 20, you shall not make for yourself a sculptured image or a likeness of what is in the heavens above or on the earth below or in the waters under the earth. It doesn't even talk about worshiping it. And we might make the argument in a few minutes that they never worshipped it. But you can't make it, and it doesn't apply only. It says lo taseh lecha pesel, which is kind of fascinating. It's the opposite of pesal lecha. But in any case, you can't make a pesel, but you also can't make the image. So the woven hangings, wall hangings that we discussed a second ago, are in the same category. So one of the other answers that he gives, he says it's usual in the Torah that there are exceptions to every rule. He goes, you can't do everything that was done in the temple on Shabbat unless you work in the temple. The Kohanim used to bring sacrifices and kill things. We all know that if a baby is born and 8 days later it's the Brit falls on Shabbat, you break Shabbat and do the Brit. Ritual fringes you can have of linen and wool. So that's another fascinating thing, that it's not the first time that we've seen a commandment that is broken explicitly by the Torah itself. I don't know whether that gives it, a kind of walk on the wild side type of extra stolen waters are sweet, or makes it a higher level of holiness, but certainly there is precedent there, and this would be one of those exceptions.
It's a great chizkuni. It's really a good chizkuni, because the chizkuni basically says that what the Torah is about is rules and their exceptions. Maybe you say that's what legal systems are about. Every legal system has the rule and its exceptions. But the Torah is like that too. Everything has its exception. So Shabbos is Shabbos, but it has its exception. And Shatnez is Shatnez, but it has its exception. And idolatry is idolatry, but it has its exceptions. That's such a great idea.
So in the Talmud in Chagiga, it takes it one step further. It says, it starts by saying that the likeness of their faces, they had the face of a man and the four had the face of a lion. Now we're talking about really the divine chariot in Ezekiel. Then it says, Reish Lakish said, Ezekiel requested mercy with regard to it, the face of the ox. He thought that the cherubim had this ox, and you can see in some Syrian and Iraqi things, they have these gigantic animals that are guarding the temple, and they have wings on them. And he said before him, Reish Lakish said, Master of the universe, an accuser becoming a defender. He says, if we have that in the temple, That's like reminding you of the golden calf every time we come into the Holy of Holies and request. There's you don't wear gold on Yom Kippur, and the beautiful explanation, which is Greek, is ein ketega na'aseh senega, that the defendant doesn't become the prosecutor. Don't remind God of gold. And here we are. We have these golden, according to this interpretation, face of an ox. It's taking this concept of making that which is forbidden permitted in a fascinating moment on a fascinating day. If you follow it through to that it's not simply a graven image, but it's a graven image of a graven ox, so to speak. Fascinating, just fascinating. The rabbis were aware of the issue here, no question about it.
No question about it. The rabbis were very much aware of the issue. Now, I don't know if they have a good answer, but they're aware of the issue.
So we already established that that which is forbidden is not simply to worship these graven images, but also to make it. But certainly the question is, what was the function of these cherubim, of these cherubs? And there is no sense, I think you'll agree with me, that they were ever worshipped. We can't force the question to the point where we say, and they built an idol because they worship these cherubim. In Exodus 25, it says, there I will meet with you, and I will impart to you from above the cover, from between the two cherubim that are on top of the Ark of the Covenant, all that I will command you. In Numbers 7, it says, when Moses went into the tent of meeting to speak with God, he would hear the voice addressing him from above the cover that was on top of the Ark of the Covenant between the cherubim. Thus God spoke to him. So Rashi explains, this verse explains exactly what happened. Moses came into the tabernacle, and as soon as he had passed the entrance, a voice fell from heaven to the place on the cover which was between the cherubim, and from there it issued and was heard by Moses in the tent of meeting outside the Holy of Holies. That's kind of fascinating. What do you make of that?
You know what's great about these discussions? It's one of those things that you can't possibly imagine, right? Like, what was it like? How did God communicate through the Holy of Holies and through the Cherubim and through the Ark? So you love when the commentators kind of paint a picture for us, because it's really just their imagination also. And I think we can really relate to that imagination.
You know, when you walk into a room and you hear a voice, what's the first thing you do? You look around. You want to see a source for the voice. You want to find the speaker. You want to find the person. I think it's
best thing is that when there is no source, that's real. That's mysterious. You see, it's interesting that God wants to be mysterious. Just, I don't know what the right answer is, but, it's just interesting that it's important that God is mysterious. It's important that no one is allowed in the Holy of Holies.
But what I like is on the one hand, he or she wants to be mysterious, but on the other hand, when you move your head from side to side looking for the source, he's made it so you can look at the cherubim. He's projecting his voice to come through the cherubim. According to Numbers that we just quoted, and this Rashi, and it's not so much Rashi. It's really, if you look at it, the verse in Numbers 7:89. I mean, it literally says when Moses went into the tent, he could hear the voice addressing him from above the cover that was on top of the Ark of the Pact between the two cherubim. I mean, it's right there. There's this wonderful expression in the Talmud when you hear a voice. It's called a bat kol. But here's kind of the source. It's a daughter. It's a child of a voice. It emanates from here. You need a place to focus. That's how I read it. That it provides a place to focus. Clearly, nothing to worship, but that you need something like that is kind of fascinating.
Really fascinating, right? I think that's right. I think, and this is all, that's what it's about, because since they're just kind of imagining it, but it's so interesting the way they imagine it. And they need something, you need a way to focus on God, but it needs to be mysterious, and it kind of needs to be secret. It's kind of our secret code. You know, we have that, by the way, God's name. We don't pronounce God's name the way it's spelt. That's not a mistake. That's part of the mystery.
You know, the next focus that I had was maybe because we're talking about artifice here, maybe the something that we have to focus on is how it was made. So I looked at Exodus 32:4 with the golden calf, and it says, "This he took from them and cast in a mold and made it into a molten calf. V'yatza ota becheret egel maseka." And Rashi, and that's something that's beautiful about all the Rashis on the process, is for all of them, he has to go to ancient or old French, I guess, because we're really talking about technology, how these things are made. And one of the things I was focused on for a little bit was, you know, when you mold an idol, when it's a molten image, maybe that is part, because in our verses, I read them quickly, but if you focused, it really did focus on how they would to be made. It says that they should be hammered work, mikashe osa otam. And I thought maybe it's the process that is the problem here. When you mold something, you're clearly making it totally in your image. You've got to create the mold. You pour it into the mold. It is totally man-made. And maybe I was thinking, when you hammer it, you're almost exploring what's inside of it. I didn't get that too far, but I really felt that there was a focus on all of these explanations, that the process mattered.
Yeah, there's no question that the process matters. I mean, you know, we can go back to the very beginning. Why does the Torah bother telling us about the building of the tabernacle twice? You pointed out the fact that a lot of these commentaries we're looking at are from the first time it's mentioned in Truma. My question is, why do you need it twice? And maybe it's because it wants to emphasize the fact that the process matters.
Alan, what say you?
Well, it's really fascinating stuff. I love listening to you guys kind of work on this. But where I'm going basically has to do with taking a look at Cherub of Cherub and relating it to Merkava, Rechav, you know, from Yecheskel, from Ezekiel, and they're all related to taking a ride of some sort, you know. And so, what is this ride, you know, that Hashem is taking? You know, it's possibly from the unknowable to something more knowable in the Mishkan. You know, it says he's taking this ride. And possibly that has to do with the Cherub itself, and also there's a sense of that I get from on either side, and they're facing each other also, and that there's something significant to me that I feel that the fact that they're facing panim el panim, and they're like, you know, thinking of a typewriter. They're like the margins of a typewriter, defining the space, you know, where the Nabim are going to have their prophetic experience in between those cherubs. So all these kind of images come to mind.
Let me just say, it's interesting you connect the word krub with merkava, because they're not actually the same word, but it's an interesting idea. It's actually a flip of the letters. The resh comes before the chaf, so it's not actually the same word. But you say that it's a journey. That's interesting. The kruvim, Geoffrey, that's interesting. We all go on a journey, right? It's part of the journey, God's journey to us and our journey back to God.
Well, I think what Alan made me really focus on, which I hadn't before, is we really haven't focused on the wing part of it. You know, when God created the world, it says murachefet al pnei tehom, that he murachefet is he fluttered. He fluttered above the abyss. And then when he took us out of Egypt, he took us on eagle's wings. And when Alan, you said something about riding, that really conjured up that image to me, that if we are going to use an image, this is an image that has been there from the beginning. I do think that's fascinating.
But what is the ride then? What is the ride? You know?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I just love that image of the ride. So it takes we said that it was, according to modern day scholarship, maybe the most easy explanation is a combination of two things. But all of those two things seem to have the wings, because they have a face and they have wings. And you mentioned both. You said face to face, and you also said the ride. And I do find that fascinating, and I agree. It's a permissible image, because I think it is a very critical image to the narrative from the first psukim of Genesis. Let's go on a little bit more, because I did want to focus on the crafting part, because we are in a parsha that literally repeats word for word what's been said before, but it does it from the perspective of crafting. So this whole concept of a beaten work shall that make it, mikashet ta'aseh. Rashi on Exodus 25 says, they laid down a large mass of gold when thou beginnest to make the lid, and beat upon the middle of it with a hammer or with a mallet, so that its ends will project upward and stand out in relief, and then shape the cherubim out of the projecting images. So they literally took this piece of metal and they hammered it. It had to have been from one piece. One of the words that he uses in French to say what you can't do is, he says you cannot join two pieces together. And he says in old French that is souder. And of the commentary says, and in English that means to solder. So
well, there you go. Okay.
So there is something about, and I was fascinated by that process. Did that process make it something that then became kosher, as opposed to the molten image of pouring it? I just think fascinating stuff. The Ibn Ezra, when he says beaten work, he says beaten kamo shaveh. It has to be equal. Well, one of the things that we really haven't focused on is that you really don't get just one karuv, one angel, if you will. They're always in pairs. And what he makes that, I'm reminded, and we can't get into all the material right now. We always try to finish on the half hour. But I am reminded, because some of the commentaries say that the faces were the faces of a man and a woman looking at each other, and that brought up in my mind the commentary on why the first rendering of the creation of man was he created man, and in the second is he created the male and female. And one of the explanations was that when man was single, God was worried that he would be like one of us, that he would say, you're single, I'm single. You're unitary, you're self-contained, I am too. And at that time, some of the commentaries says he was androgynous. He had everything. He could even replicate himself. And then the second part was he was taken apart to be man and woman. And that's what that reminded me of, that you're taking this one piece of metal and you're making breaking it into two, and those two are even man and women. I think it is a fascinating area of discussion. If you are fascinated as much as I am with it, you will look into the notes, because one of the things, the myths that has been broken is, and I've mentioned this before, there was a great Israeli scholar named Yechezkel Kaufman, and he almost was impacted by the caricature that the Bible uses to describe idolatry. It's all based on stuff that you can find in Isaiah that says, how can a person make a god? How can a god who is a piece of stone yesterday become a god today? Really, really makes fun of the artifice of making an idol. And one of the follow-ups to that, he has his own solution to the reason why in the Bible it was a caricature. He argues that the children of Israel was they had progressed so much that they didn't understand idolatry. But if you'll see in the notes, we do now have renderings of Babylonia where they have discussions of the 2 or 3 or 4 days that it takes to make a god. And actually, there was much more intentionality to it. So we're not that far away. I do believe what it focuses on is the intentionality was critical here. And that's what makes the whole subject so absolutely fascinating. I think we need to focus less on the image part and more on the intention part and the lessons that have to be learned, and that will open up new worlds to us.
Great. That is a fascinating conversation today. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Geoffrey. Next Thursday, I will be in Israel en route back home. So Geoffrey is going to take Vayikra on his own. We look forward to a great week with everybody. Shabbat Shalom, and enjoy your week. Be well, everybody.
Thank you so much, Nasiya Tova, Rabbi, and we'll miss you next week. It's just very fascinating to me that when we look at the quote-unquote taboos and we look at the quote-unquote things that one religion doesn't do or ever does, it's like they always say, what unites us is more than what divides us. And this is certainly a case. One of the scholarly articles that I quote talks about, when Isaiah put down the Babylonians, he was just pissed that the temple was destroyed, and it was polemics in the old sense of the word. But we Jews also could breathe life into inanimate objects, make ourselves tablets of the law, and make ourselves cherubim, and spend an evening discussing what those cherubim were.
Yeah, Geoffrey. I don't know whether you guys, because I got into the discussion a little late. Did you talk about the first instance of cherubim at Gan Eden? Because that's really kind of interesting, I think.
Well, absolutely. I did mention it in regard to who were the cherubim, and for those who say they were little babies with innocent faces and wings on them, you have to go back to Genesis and to say, well, what about the ones with the swords who were keeping us out of Eden? And I think when I mentioned that, I used it as a segue to say that modern scholarship really feels that, and I quote an article that kind of surveys all of the literature and comes to this conclusion, that it's as much, cherub is almost a generic word for a combination of two creatures. And so to say, because there are opinions in the rabbinic literature for sure, that they were birds, that they were oxen with wings. The truth is they all seem to have wings because that's what the verse says. They all seem to have faces because that's what the verse says. But what were those faces? Was it an ox? Was it a bird? Was it a god? We talked about the cherubim being kind of a way that God could transmit his voice through, but certainly there's an aspect of them that guarded the Holy of Holies and guarded the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah, absolutely. So would you be up for taking a look at Genesis 3:24? Just the language of it is really interesting, I find.
Well, absolutely. So I have it here in the notes, and it says "V'garesh et Adam." Garesh is a wonderful word. It's the same word as divorce. He exiled the human. V'yashkein mikedem, and he was in the Garden of Eden. And he put v'yashkein is almost planted the et hakruvim, these cherubim. And he put a sword, lachat hacherev mithapechet. Now there is, and I had never noticed that, that's very similar to the wings that I mentioned earlier in Genesis 1. I don't know if it's 1:1 or 1:2, but it says, V'ruach Elohim mirachefet al pnei tahom. That it's fascinating, and I had never noticed that before, that these turning sword was turning in the same way as wings turn to guard the way to the tree of life.
But I'm getting the feeling from the word, and I might have it wrong. Mit hafechet. It's related to hefech. In a way, I'm getting a sense of motion also.
Yes.
Like moving, like the ride, what we're talking about, basically.
Well, that's what mitrachefet means. The Spirit of God was hovering, and the hovering was like a winged animal. That was like a hummingbirds. Yes, that's my image of that combines both the sword and the wings.
Right, but I'm getting a sense of movement. Remember, we were talking about cherubim had to do with ride or some movement from one place to another. So I'm just getting that sense of taking a look at cherubim in the sense of some kind of movement from one place to another, and then that word mithapechet having to do again with something in movement. And then it says lishmor es derech Eitz Chaim, not lishmor es Eitz Chaim, or es derech. So it's the path. And in a way, the two cherubim are in a way watching over and protecting and the path, basically the derech.
Yeah, and from that perspective, where they are over the Ark of the Covenant, and the fact that it was only visited once a year it's a very rare path that's taken very seriously, and there it is, and that also kind of focuses. I was struck by the sense that the Bible literally says that the voice of God is kind of projected through the two cherubim. It's kind of given an audible pathway type of thing. I think it's fascinating, but it's fascinating that here we are Jews talking about an image. It's so counter. And I didn't have a chance to really see how Islam deals with this, because of course, Islam, when it comes to images and both molten and fixed, is Judaism on steroids. They have no flexibility in terms of that, and I give them credit for that. But I wonder how they deal with this, whether the cherubim feature in the Quran or in their tradition. That I didn't have time to explore.
But in our sense of prophecy, from my understanding and study of Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan's works, that the cherubim were really a focal point for the Nabim for prophecy. So they really functioned, I think, on that level of direction of prophecy, especially from Moshe Rabbeinu, I think.
Yeah, and when you talk about focus, you can't not talk about kavanah and direction. And, this is where it comes from. But again, I have argued in prior podcasts and discussions how I think that we Jews have lost a lot of body language that used to be a part of worship and stuff like that. And here we have physical objects that are a part of worship. And, we've kind of so gotten into this cerebral sense of religion. And maybe because we've become kind of polemical, and whether it's Christianity with the bowing and others with or the imaging, that we pulled back from it. But it's part of us, and there's no question. When I do yoga, if you want to keep your balance, you need to focus on a particular space. Yeah, otherwise you're down.
Absolutely. But also, like in many shuls, like more Kabbalistic type shuls, you're likely to see on the wall a shavisi, which is a meditation device. It's clearly a picture, but it's clearly there to give you focus.
Yeah, but it's less of a picture and it's more words. But there's no question about it. There's merit there. There's an area that needs further discussion and further exploration by Jews who are not necessarily comfortable talking about images, not necessarily talking about body movements and breath and things like that. And I love it when you can't ignore what the Torah says.
Absolutely.
Anyway, it was great having you on board. Come again. And thank you so much for your insight, because I love the concept of riding on it. I love bringing in the Merkava as well. So Shabbat Shalom, and we'll see you all next week.